Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alex Trianis, Dean of the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Carey Business School Distinguished Speaker Series. Through our Distinguished Speaker Series, we bring to you the most accomplished business professionals to discuss today's most compelling business challenges. Today, we've assembled a panel of industry experts to discuss the COVID-19 vaccine from its discovery to delivery. The COVID-19 pandemic is one of the greatest challenges of our lifetime, from both a health perspective and a business perspective. It was just a year ago this week, the first case of COVID-19 in the United States was diagnosed, nearly 2 months before the World Health Organization declared the disease a pandemic. A year later, the pandemic has claimed more than 400,000 American lives and more than 2 million worldwide. As we grieve for the lives lost to COVID-19, there is hope that a series of new vaccine candidates will turn the tide of this pandemic. New vaccines have been developed in record time and ready to be manufactured and distributed. The speed at which these new vaccines were developed and deployed is a perfect example of the vital connection between business and health, which our panelists will explore today. Now I'll turn it over our discussion to Professor Dan Polsky. Dan is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Health Economics with appointments at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. He also directs the Hopkins Business of Health Initiative. He previously spent 2 decades on the faculties at Wharton and the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and was the executive director of the Leonard Davis Institute for Health Economics at Penn. Dan, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Alex. It's great to be able to moderate this panel with these fantastic panelists. I'm going to get right to it. We got a lot of ground to cover in the next 80 minutes or so. As Alex mentioned, we're going to talk about COVID-19 vaccine strategy all the way from discovery through manufacturing and commercialization and delivery into the arms of everyone across the globe. So we have lots to discuss. And our hope is that you can derive business lessons from our experts who have navigated many challenges in the past year, and we'll also cover many of the challenges ahead. But I also suspect that many of you are interested not only for the business lessons, but also like, where do I get a vaccine? When do I get it? We'll do our best to get some of those practicalities and touch on some of the kind of public health nature of what's ahead of us. So I'm moderating. Here's the kind of the tone for the day, the outline, if you will. So I'll do some brief introductions of our panelists. We'll kick over an intro question to each of our panelists to give their perspective from where they sit along this continuum. Then we'll open up across our panel to interact with each other for a more open discussion. We'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So don't hesitate to use the Q&A function in post. We may not address questions typing directly, but we will be scanning it and it'll be informing our interactions along the way. So please participate as best that you can. That really makes for a much more lively interaction during our time together. So I'll be very brief with introductions. I believe they're in the kind of the registration materials, but I would like to say a couple things about our distinguished panelists because it just lends itself so nicely to their perspectives here. So we'll start with William Enright, or Bill. He's Chief Executive Officer at Vaccitech, which is the biotech behind AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine. Bill brings a breadth of experiences in a variety of positions within life sciences and the biotech industry, including time as a consultant, a bench scientist, and 12 years with Life Technologies. He's worked in various senior level licensing, business management, and manufacturing and research roles. Most importantly, from his bio, Bill received a Master's of Science in Business Administration from Johns Hopkins University Carey School of Business. Welcome, Bill. Our next panelist is Abigail Jenkins. She is Senior Vice President and Vaccine Business Unit Head at Emergent Biosolutions, where she has global end-to-end responsibility for commercialization of the vaccine portfolio. Emergent has responded to COVID pandemic by providing contract development and manufacturing services to government and pharma and biotech customers, as well as by developing their own plasma-based therapeutic candidates. Abby has over 20 years of experience building customer-centric organizations that develop and launch products offering meaningful benefits to patients in diseases of unmet need. And importantly, Abby has earned a Master's of Science in Biotechnology and Biotech Business Enterprise from Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Abby. And our third panelist, Reed Tuckson, MD, is Managing Director of Tuckson Health Connections, a health and medical consulting business focusing on optimal health outcomes and value. His capacity as a public health leader, he served on the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's committee to develop a framework for the equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccine. He's been at the forefront of urging Black communities to embrace a COVID-19 vaccine. He was Executive Vice President and Chief of Medical Affairs for United Health Group for many years, and has held a number of senior service leadership positions across the national healthcare landscape. And he studied at the Wharton Business School, so that is extremely important to me, but also he's an advisory board member of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. So they all have strong connections to Johns Hopkins University, and we're so glad to have such a distinguished panel. So I'm going to start with discovery. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill Enright from Vaccitech. So to start off, a remarkable achievement in medical science. We've gone from identifying a new pathogen, the novel coronavirus, to discovering an immune response against it, to developing and testing a safe and effective vaccine in less than 12 months. Previously, the fastest vaccine to go from development to deployment was the mumps vaccine in the 60s, which took almost 4 years. So I know we could spend all day on this one question, but can you share from a business perspective the most important facilitators for this extraordinary achievement? Bill?
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to everyone listening today. I think we're going to have a very interesting panel discussion. So just by a little way of context, as Daniel mentioned, Vaccitech is involved in the development of vaccines and therapeutics to treat chronic infections and cancer. And the background technology platform that is in the AstraZeneca vaccine is also used in a number of our other products. And so we were involved in the early development. So literally 2 days after the sequence was available, we had designed and ordered DNA to move into our platform, and working together with our colleagues at the University of Oxford, built the initial vaccine constructs and started moving those towards manufacturing, so that we could get material for preclinical studies and eventually into the clinic. And as you mentioned, Daniel, that this happened with remarkable speed. I mean, the reality of this situation is that the number of emerging and infectious diseases is increasing, or at least the identification of those emerging and infectious diseases is increasing over the last 80 years. More and more, been over 60 new and emerging infectious diseases identified in the last decade. So this isn't a one and done. This is a continuing problem that's going to face us. And so, that's one of the things in consideration here, as you think about it from a business perspective, is, how are you going to deal with these emerging infectious diseases, in particular the SARS-CoV-2? Vaccines are an interesting way. They've probably saved more lives in history as a class than probably anything but antibiotics and clean water across the world. So it's an effective way to treat these new and emerging infectious diseases, but you have to do that in a very short time period if they're going to be effective to deal with the morbidity and mortality associated with some of these diseases. And that's really where the focus of this platform is how quickly can you get something from sequence identification to the market. And we've shown that we can do that unbelievably quickly as compared to past. And I would say that the key thing here is money. To be honest, that's the key driver for being able to do things quickly. So the way current product development is set up across the board is to do things in series. So you're limiting risk all along the way, because we know that a very small percentage of products that enter development will actually make it through to commercialization. And so your companies trying to limit their risk along the whole development pathway. So one of the key things here is governments and NGOs put up large amounts of money to try and take that part of the equation away, so that we can do things in parallel instead of in series. And that is really a core piece of the speed at which we were able to do things. So we didn't take shortcuts. Things were just done at the same time, where you would normally wait for results. You started preclinical work, where you were normally waiting for preclinical work. You started toxicology and biodistribution studies, where you're normally waiting for those. You started manufacturing, and so on and so on. I think the other thing that really led to the speed at which we were able to develop this vaccine was some advances from a regulatory science perspective. So regulatory agencies were more likely to look at innovative clinical trial designs, adaptive clinical trial designs. They were looking at streamlining release testing. Again, not circumventing the release testing or circumventing the safety things that were done from a clinical trial perspective, but working with companies hand in hand. And so you had very close relationships between companies and the regulatory agencies. You had cooperation between industry, where you see companies collaborating with each other, free-flowing information. A lot of publications occurring as quickly as data could become available, so that it was accessible to everybody. That was good and bad. So some things probably got published too soon without being totally peer reviewed, but so there are pros and cons to some of that. And then the other thing is on the emergency use authorizations. And I think, again, that lends to the speed. So again, not trying to compromise safety, making sure that we have sufficient safety testing done in people through the clinical trials, but then speeding the rate at which you could bring those things to mass vaccination, because the overarching goal is to get as many vaccines out to the public as quickly as possible to, again, stop morbidity and mortality.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to turn now to Abby Jenkins. I have so many questions that sit in this pathway from discovery, we got to commercialize this stuff. We have to manufacture it. So, we can't skip any steps. So I'm really curious, what does it take to build an infrastructure for large scale vaccine commercialization manufacturing? And particularly, I'm interested in the role of Emergent for deploying its capabilities to combat COVID-19, and what has made it possible to perform and produce at the volume and scale needed during this urgent and unprecedented health crisis. Abby?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Thanks so much for having me here this afternoon. Before we jump into answering those specific questions, I think it's important to set the stage to give a bit of background on Emergent Biosolutions, which is a company that many of you may not have heard of, or at least not have heard of before the pandemic. Emergent is a global life sciences company in the business of addressing public health threats, whose mission is to protect and enhance life. So our business was literally designed for a moment like this, one that we certainly hoped would never happen, but if it did, as was the case in 2020, then Emergent would be there standing ready to respond. And Emergent is organized into 4 business units. So the first one is a therapeutics business targeting infectious diseases. The second is our devices business with a product that may be more familiar to some of you called Narcan nasal spray for opioid overdose. Our third division, which is the one most visible in the pandemic, is our contract development manufacturing, or CDMO business, where we develop and manufacture vaccines for other pharmaceutical companies. And that's the one that's certainly gotten a lot of attention this year. We're developing and manufacturing vaccines with Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca and a number of other groups as well. And then our fourth business unit is focused on developing and delivering our own vaccines, which is the one that I lead. And the vaccine space at Emergent, like the company itself, focuses specifically on unique public health threats. And we have vaccines on the market or in development for biological threats like anthrax and smallpox, travel health diseases like typhoid and cholera, and existing and emerging infectious diseases like pandemic influenza and Lassa fever. So it's a very specific niche of the market. Since we have a lot of attendees from the Carey Business School and thus are having a business versus more science-focused audience conversation type today, I thought it would be helpful to discuss some of the most important business elements to consider when commercializing vaccines. Of course, that's assuming that there's a strong scientific rationale behind your product and you believe it can be clinically safe and effective, as Bill was saying. Assuming that's got a good proof of principle, then you need to think about the market and the competitive landscape and the manufacturing elements. And this is obviously true for traditional vaccines, but I'd say even for COVID-19 vaccines, this is something companies have to consider. So in the category of, is there a market? And for a pandemic situation, one must consider not only the immediacy of the pandemic, but the long-term aspects, as most vaccines have a competitive lifespan that's far longer than traditional pharmaceuticals. And then what's the competitive landscape, and is there an opportunity for differentiation between the products after the immediate need of just any vaccine, that can be EUA approved, when you're thinking more around the long term for coronavirus or COVID-19? That's something to be mindful of. From a manufacturing perspective, and you hear a lot about the clinical efficacy of products and safety, but in the end, a lot of times the success of a product comes down to manufacturing. It can be the rate limiting step to getting your product to market, even getting it licensed or EUA approved. And certainly scaling up manufacturing is one of the greatest costs that goes into the product. And over the long term, the cost of goods is something that will ultimately impact the bottom line and profitability. So, and I would say for small companies and those that are trying to get in the space and compete, these are real factors, especially if their COVID vaccines didn't receive a lot of funding. So these are certainly the things you would think about for traditional vaccines, but even in this landscape, it's something to consider. So for some of the other questions that Dan was asking around what it takes to build that type of infrastructure and how did we at Emergent make this possible, for us, certainly being in the business of responding to public health threats for the last 20 years, we were well positioned for this moment. We have longstanding partnerships with the US government, as well as some international government partners, and we have a reputation for being able to step up and deliver in situations like these, especially high pressure, short timeline deliveries. Second, our CDMO service, that business unit I had mentioned, operates one of the pandemic response manufacturing centers that was established in partnership with the US government back in 2012 for situations just like what we're facing right now. So through that facility in Baltimore, Maryland, not that far from the Johns Hopkins campus, actually, we're manufacturing bulk drug substance for COVID-19 vaccines, either for use in clinical trials or for commercial purposes for other manufacturers. So on the one hand, we had this facility and it was built and ready to operate, ready to respond to a pandemic over the last several years. But as the pandemic unfolded, we still had to go from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time. We had to set up various manufacturing lines and suites to accommodate not just one product, but a variety of vaccine types, each in various stages of development, working with a variety of different customers. And for those of you, in business, that customers have different needs, different expectations, unique specifications, and all of that customization certainly added some complexity to the process. In this case, as Bill was just saying, we had to work closely not only with these manufacturers, but with the US government, with the FDA, as each of these products was literally moving at warp speed under a pathway that previously didn't exist. Just as he was saying, usually you would do things more in sequence, and the entire industry was moving more in parallel. So to just break this down from a more tactical business perspective, this meant from procurement, we were trying to buy equipment that was in high demand, like bioreactors and freezers and secure raw materials that are used in the manufacturing process. Even something that sounds so simple, like securing extra warehouse space to just store the things we were going to need, became something of urgency. From a staffing perspective, coming into 2020, we had 1,800 employees across 19 locations globally, which, depending where you are in an industry, 1,800 either sounds like a tiny company or sounds like a huge company. But for us, it meant that we had to basically increase our employee base by 50%. And almost 50% of those, about 400 colleagues, was just to support the COVID-19 vaccine production effort. And that was in that last half of the year. So that, I think, alone is just a really complex business problem. You need to ramp up, you need to scale up, you need to be able to deliver, and just getting people to do all the work can become a rate limiting step. We also had to consider seconding employees from other company locations who had vaccine or manufacturing experience. Members of my team in San Diego who were experienced in vaccine development and manufacturing were seconded from San Diego to Baltimore, which brings me to another element of the situation, which is management prioritization and decision-making in business. So Emergent, as a for-profit, publicly traded business, we had to be financially responsible while also being laser focused on our goals and commitments to customers, all the while demonstrating care toward our employees, especially those who are in laboratory or manufacturing roles, who were, braving this COVID risk themselves to make this possible. And this meant that we had to make really tough choices around what was most important, which in this case, obviously the number one priority was the COVID-19 work, but it meant that other employees who are working on other development programs or other important vaccine programs, their work may have to be delayed or deprioritized so that we can transfer those resources to the COVID-19 effort. And certainly we had to create new safety protocols and procedures and different types of employee safety measures, because our employee safety was at the forefront throughout this process, because we knew that we couldn't deliver without our workforce to do it. And just to take a moment before we jump into the next part of the development process and delivery process, just to say that I'm so incredibly proud of the role that Emergent has been able to play in this global public health crisis. It's a great business story for those of you that are familiar with the Blue Ocean Strategy concept, which is about carving out a unique space that your business and only your business can really compete in, and then being obsessively dedicated to that. Emergent has certainly accomplished this from a business perspective, but also in building an employee base that feels deeply connected to the mission of the company, committed to the work that we do in support of protecting the whole world and protecting each other, in this case from COVID. And I think that the latter, that employee element, is often underappreciated in thinking about commercialization or the business of working in the pharmaceutical industry, but it shouldn't be, because we certainly would have failed in executing our business without that hard work, dedication, commitment, connectivity of our Emergent team. So Dan, back to you.
Thank you. Wow, this is just already, so many issues on the table, and I think so many things for us to go back and forth on. But I want to kind of get all the perspectives on the table from discovery to delivery. And so I'm going to turn it to Reed Tuckson. So Reed, you bring a wide range of perspectives as a physician, public health leader, and former executive VP and Chief of Medical Affairs at United Health Group, to help us understand the challenges of going from the vaccine to a vaccination. And I'll also bring up again the your service as on the NASM consensus panel with me that established this framework for equitable allocation of the vaccine for the novel coronavirus, as this was something that we were in deep discussions about late in the summer, and has kind of is playing out in real time as we speak. So what I'd like to put to you here is why it's so important to deliver vaccines according to these specific phases when it's in short supply. Like there's a guidelines and certain framework in effect, and given the business orientation of our audience, maybe you could outline a bit the logistical and organizational challenges to get this right, and touch on the role that business can play in addressing the challenges of moving from the vaccine to a vaccination in a fair and speedy way.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. I really appreciate it, and great to be with you and the panelists. I'll look at this from maybe 6 quick points in the few minutes that I have. First off is there has to be a framework and a philosophy that guides the decisions that have to be made on who gets it and when. Having scarcity of a life-saving product brings a certain moral and ethical framework, moral and ethical demands to the entire equation from the very beginning. There has to be a clear understanding and consideration of how are decisions made, especially when life and death is on the line for an initially very scarce product. And that means there has to be attentiveness to fairness, there has to be an attentiveness to equity, and there has to be an attentiveness to making decisions based upon who are among us the most vulnerable in our society, and how do we ensure that those who are either the most vulnerable or those whose roles are the most critical to protecting the entire society. And so, as you intimated, the National Academy of Medicine Committee did look at those issues, and that's where the recommendations first arose for treating first those who are working in our healthcare system on the front lines, and then those who are particularly vulnerable, whether they are because they are inmates in institutions where they have no control over life or death and they're dying at great rates, or because the people of color, as a major example, who have so many pre-existing conditions that leave them so much more vulnerable to a disproportionate death rate. So fairness and equity was very important. Similarly, that there has to be a decision that is based upon the relationship between the public and private sector. Unfortunately now, as we've heard, even as recently as today, the CDC can't tell us how much vaccine product there is. And so the allocation framework is very confused because we are simply operating in an environment of lack of information. Number two, we've got to make decisions on how the product is disseminated and administered. What forces and resources will be involved? What we want is easy, convenient, and affordable access. That became challenging with these vaccines because they required heavy duty refrigeration, which meant that it wasn't as easy as administering these as other vaccines that we've had. Still, there has to be planning that had to undergo not only for this historical moment, but as other vaccine products come online, we have to really be thinking about that. And so the role of federal government and state government becomes very important. What we are seeing now with this mass confusion is that the previous administration did not well understand the fundamental relationships between the federal government and state public health departments. And further, that when you have seen one state health department, you have seen one state health department, that there is enormous variability in the line that goes from federal through state to county to city to local community. And that has been very challenging. We also had to be very clear about the role of private sector, particularly physicians. It is unclear at this point what that role will be and how will private physicians eventually participate in the process. Similarly, there is great concern for how will community-based organizations and faith-based organizations, will they have a role to participate or not? These have fundamental determinants around whether or not there is uptake, access, and convenience in being able to do this. Number three, financing and administration becomes very important, of course. Thankfully, the vaccines were bought by the federal government, and so the vaccine cost goes away, but the administration fee by those in the chain becomes an issue. And so the insurance mechanisms come into play, as does the role of self-insured employers comes into play, as well as having to create the appropriate billing codes. And so we have been able now thankfully, to make sure that almost every person will have free administration in addition to free vaccine itself. And so that will be watched very carefully. Number 4 will be, how do people connect with the available supply? When is my turn? And we understand those issues well, that no one is comfortable with that. But we also know that scarcity will breed black markets. That's just the nature of the way that business works. And so we are seeing rich people jumping the line. We're seeing certain kinds of businesses like the sports business, where they're trying to very hard to get their people immunized ahead of others so that they can continue to operate their businesses. This is a very fundamental ethical conundrum in the midst of a business analysis. And then, of course, the next issue is that we know that these vaccines require more than one dose, at least the ones that we have now. And so there has to be a model that allows to track who's gotten their first dose and ensuring that people will be able to get their second dose because they know they're supposed to. That presupposes the kinds of upstream business decisions that have to be made as to whether or not we are going to try to spread as much of the available vaccine supply for the first doses, even when we're not really sure that we've got enough to backfill for the second dose. This is a huge issue because there is a limited window of effectiveness to be able to get that second dose into people to meet the 95% confidence intervals that we now believe are true for the vaccine being able to protect us from becoming severely ill or dying. And then lastly, we have the challenge of tracking usage and post-marketing surveillance. We know that we need to know now who's getting access, what are the populations that are receiving it, so that we'll be able to know where to target on high priority subpopulations that may be suboptimally vaccinated. But we also have the opportunity to use mobile health apps and other technologies that will come to bear. That starts to move us into an interesting arena of the conjoint use of apps and other digital tools, hopefully to be able to do this job well, while not making those who are anxious and nervous about the use of data even more nervous about participating in this kind of process. So those are 6 key elements that take us along the continuum of the delivery system. And we are clearly, as a summation point, in a moment of great confusion, great chaos. And I think that what we are now seeing, unfortunately, is inadequate strategic and environmental planning, inadequate understanding of the realities on the ground. And we're having to see this new administration try to work through those in a very expeditious way.
Thank you. So keep questions coming into the Q&A, but I'm going to throw out a question that I think every one of you can chime in on, and it's a little bit working backward from some of the issues that Reed put on the table, and it's one is we're in shortage, and there's been a challenge of as Reed laid out, that I think is mostly due to organizational and administrative and kind of distributional communication issues that I guess I want to hear from you about the role of the manufacturers and just these new vaccines coming online. Like I don't think this is an issue so much of they're going to be more vaccines. We're not going to run out of, like, over the next few months, are we going to run out of vaccines, or is the challenge more administrative? So from each of your perspectives, how do you see the next few months playing out in terms of, new vaccines coming online, enough capacity of just actual doses to the delivery into the arms, at least of Americans here, but I think we should, expand that as well. So I don't know the best place to start, but I think we'll just maybe go back to Bill for that, for this kind of first round of discussion.
Sure. So I think a lot of interesting points were raised here, and one of the issues that we have to consider is, as you were saying, is looking at the global distribution of vaccines. Right, so it goes beyond the U.S. And are you getting equitable distribution of vaccine to all healthcare workers around the world before sports guys are treated with vaccines, and looking at those issues. So I think, to your question, I think there definitely will be more vaccines. Right now, there are 2 approved in the U.S., both the RNA vaccines. There are several others that are nearing approval, including the AstraZeneca vaccine and the J&J vaccine. And I think you'll see a couple of additional vaccines following that. That doesn't mean that there won't be shortages. And I think we'll continue to see shortages. It actually brings up a different issue, one that was raised by Reed, as far as the length of time between when you give the first dose and the second dose. Typically in clinical trials, that's a very controlled situation, and then so there's probably science behind that shows that outside of those ranges that the vaccine will work, but it wasn't tested in the clinical studies. Similarly, when you're getting the first dose of one vaccine, can you get a second dose of a different vaccine? Now, those are some of the conversations that are ongoing right now as well to help as far as the logistics go. Again, not something's tested, not typically what we would do from a regulatory perspective, but there's some scientific evidence. And in fact, that's one of the prime reasons, prime parts of the platform that Vaccitech uses is looking at heterologous prime boosts. So you 2 different technology platforms in your prime and in your boost actually may give a better immune response. But again, that wasn't tested in these clinical sites. So it's not typically how we develop drugs. And so there's a lot of these kind of ethical questions that are continuing to be raised as to, okay, if you've only tested it at 28 days, can you really give it at 90 days and have any confidence that it's going to work? If you take the Moderna vaccine, do you have to be boosted with the Moderna vaccine? Or can you give the J&J vaccine as a boost? And do you have any confidence that that's going to work? And again, you're trying to deal with the underlying issue that we've got over 400,000 deaths in the U.S. in a year, and then obviously much more than that globally. So impacting the value of what can you reasonably do with the amount of vaccines that you have available right now, because in all of these vaccines you're dealing with syringe issues, you're dealing with vial issues. Can they make enough of the pharmaceutical grade vials to vial everything that needs to be vialed? Raw materials in the various vaccines. Some of these things are in quite short demand. We've seen this before, even with like Shingrix. The adjuvant involved in that has resulted in lots of shortages on the Shingrix vaccine. So it's not something that is uncommon in the vaccine space. The difference here is more people are dying as a result of not being vaccinated, right? So it brings up different ethical and scientific dilemmas.
Thank you. You want to chime in, Abby?
Sure. I think, I agree with Bill in the sense that more vaccines are theoretically coming, right? There are other manufacturers, AZ and J&J, which are kind of next up. I think while it was never expected that only 2 manufacturers could possibly supply all of the need in the US, much less globally. So, and that was, I think, a big rationale that BARDA had for why they wanted to fund so many different companies, so that there were more shots on goal, pun intended, more shots on goal from both a clinical and safety perspective, but also from a manufacturing and supply perspective. I'm optimistic that with the Johnson & Johnson Janssen type of product, which is a single dose vaccine, it's the only one that's pretty advanced in development that would offer that type of utility. But both that product and the AZ product don't have some of the cold chain requirements, which I think it's amazing that science could move at the speed and give anybody anything. But with those kind of logistical aspects, it makes the supply chain really complicated. Shipping in the ultra cold shipping conditions that the Pfizer vaccine required, it meant that you had to ship a certain amount of product. I think they had to take a minimum of 970 doses, which equates to 195 vials. And so that also limits your flexibility in how you distribute the product and how you make sure people get access to it. It's great because you get one big shipment, but if you're at a place that doesn't need that many doses, all of a sudden you have too much supply in one place and not enough in another. The Moderna doesn't, it still has cold chain requirements, but not the ultra cold. But AZ's product and J&J's, as I understand it, are more traditional refrigerated temperatures. So I think between potentially having a single dose vaccine and then having just kind of more ease of use, let's say, in supply chain and distribution, I think those not only offer great additional, clinical protection for people, but just logistically increase our ability to get product where it needs to go and get it into people. And then certainly any additional vaccines that come out after that can fit into what I hope, as Reed was saying, will be a more effective, more efficient, administration process by that point.
Reed?
Well, I think it's important that everything that can be done upstream to provide the raw material products, the precursors for manufacturing, all of those are made available through whatever Defense Production Act, edicts and so forth, so that they have every chance to produce as rapidly as possible. What is so fascinating about this puzzle is because we have this lack of transparency and predictability, we are now making the population extremely unhappy and chaotic. The funny part is that we were spending so much of our energy worrying that vaccine hesitancy was going to be the order of the day. We fought like crazy across this country to try to get people to have confidence in the science. I was listening fascinating to Bill talking about, what do we know about modifying what we've learned from the clinical trials. Everything we have said to the American people has been, we are focusing on the science. What does the science say? Only staying in our narrow swim lane. Now, if we have to start going outside of those swim lanes, the messaging will have to be very, very carefully dealt with, because we've tried to overcome hesitancy by sticking to scientific facts and staying there. But the other thing is that what is fascinating now is that the curve of vaccine acceptance has moved so much faster than what we had ever predicted, even in communities of color, which have had lots of reasons why they should not historically trust the process. We are seeing waiting lines around the block for people of color trying to get vaccinated. So the education program worked very well. Unfortunately, the concomitant marrying with the availability did not go well. And now we have this disconnect that is causing a lot of heartache in the community. How we manage that is really what is now going to be important, not only for this pandemic, but I think Bill said something else which we really have to understand. And that is, this is not the last rodeo. And so we're going to be at this again before long. And I think that what we've got to make sure we do now is to gain the confidence, or rather regain the confidence of the American people, that the not only the manufacturing process, but the public health processes actually are competent to do their job.
I'm going to add a twist from the, bring in a couple questions from the discussion. We talk about, relying on the science, but the science, was established during the clinical trials where the virus itself, maybe, it moves. So we have these variants that are, kind of on the front page of the news. And there's a couple, really the first questions that came out were, of this variety. So we face new forms, even possible mutations. What are we facing? On top of what's already been developed. And I think, to just bring it back to more business oriented questions here, could we go back to the developmental regulatory well here? And what challenges from a kind of, I guess, a business perspective does that bring up, or what assets can we lean on?
So the good thing is, when you're vaccinating people, that you develop a polyclonal response. And so many of the variants that we're seeing will be covered by the existing vaccines. That's the good news. The bad news is that the more you vaccinate, the more, viruses survive by changing. And so the more you put competitive or environmental pressures on them, the more they will change. And eventually they'll change that won't be covered in the current vaccine. Otherwise, the virus will die away. And so eventually we will have to change the vaccine. And you saw, Moderna acted very quickly to test, and they've got a new vaccine that, a new construct that they're developing. Again, can you prime with give the first dose against one strain and then come back and give the second dose against one of the variant strains? You do have a significant level of overlap. I think there are going to be some clinical trials that start addressing that. Speaking to the science, as you said, Reed. And I think that's the one good thing about the many of the platforms that are being utilized here. Both from Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Pfizer, they're all very able to be very rapidly adapted to new strains. I think in the end, one of the questions that I see here, if I had to predict the future, my guess here is that COVID-19 vaccine will be part of your annual flu vaccine. And so instead of getting a quadrivalent flu vaccine, you'll get a pentavalent vaccine that includes the COVID-19 strain of the day and mixed in with the flu vaccine on an annual basis.
Anyone else want to join in?
I think that one of the things that is a hallmark of the drug development process is post-marketing surveillance. And I think it's going to be very important that we have the data and are tracking carefully the experience of what happens on the front end, and then feed that back in a virtuous learning cycle loop. And so I think that becomes very, very, very much the key here. We're in a dynamic environment, and we've got to make sure that we have not only that we have the data that allows us to continue to modify. And I think we also have to explain to the American people this. One of the big issues from a business point of view here is eliciting confidence. Confidence is half of the game. And so I think the more transparent we are about what we know, what we don't know, and as we can do with companies like Abigail's and others, if we can show the public, and in fact it is true, and we can show the public, that there is a adaptability, a flexibility, that we can take information, reprocess it, and keep moving. That is going to be very important, as opposed to people thinking it's a static environment, one and done. Oh my God, it didn't work. Now what are we going to do? Because things have modified. I think we have to show another level of the competencies and capabilities of the health enterprise.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just, but still kind of looking towards the future, and both from a discovery perspective and manufacturing commercialization. I found the discussion about, how we were able to kind of ramp up so quickly just fascinating, but it really sounds like it's laser focus, commitment from all parties, collaboration, it's like lightning in a bottle, all the things working for you. And that when this passes, the life sciences will go back to the way it was before. And so I guess my question is, am I wrong? What do you think is going to be different? What are lessons learned that will maybe change the shape of life sciences, of discovery, or specific to, vaccines? But I think more broadly, what might happen? Will it go faster for regular drug development, or what lessons learned, what muscles built will be sustained, and what might go different?
Well, I'm not the guy, but I'm going to see how Bill reacts or Abigail reacts to this. But because I am a cheerleader on the outside of this part, I think that one of the great untold stories of this drama has been the ability of the scientists around the world to collaborate together and work in a wonderful way. The fact that the President Biden now has rejoined the WHO and the other international forums is key. But the fact that we were, as a world science community, able to identify this new virus, be able to, as Bill laid out, decode it in 2 weeks or so time, take prototype types that were standing available after we had gone through the experience of SARS and H1N1, where the world was not prepared, and suddenly be able to have in place not only a surveillance system, but prototypes that that could be re-engineered. I think this is telling us something about the extraordinary capability of the genius of human beings when they are able to collaboratively work together around the world, and then producing the best and then sharing that around the world with others to be able to go forward. So Bill, I don't know if I've done a kumbaya moment here, but as somebody outside of your world, I am absolutely fascinated at the genius of what has occurred.
No, I think I would agree with that, Reed. I think the collaborative spirit here, I think, you know, to a person, anybody involved in the early development here really felt that, you know, the number one goal was to get as much vaccine to as many people as quickly as possible. And so people did unique things. You see, you know, pharma companies collaborating with pharma companies. You see competitors sharing information. You see private public partnerships, government spending. You know, I mean, you look at the amount of money government has spent on the vaccine development, and it's a lot of money. But you look at the economic cost to the world. It's a month's worth of the economic loss, you know. So I think when you put that in perspective, you know, it's well worth it from that side of things. So I do think some of this will stick with us. Daniel, to your original question, I think some of the strides that we've made on from the regulatory sciences things that I was speaking about earlier, I think some of those things will stick. I think some of the manufacturing and the infrastructure and scale up things will stick. I'm hoping that the investment in infectious disease will stick. As somebody who's been in this space for a long time, I can tell you when I first started in an infectious disease company, raising money was very difficult. There was only a handful of players that were involved. That seems to be a different case right now, and I'm hopeful that that will continue when we get the pandemic under control.
I think I would, I'm maybe in between Reed and Bill in the sense, or maybe more to a little bit more skeptical in the sense that I think we did everything that we could do to make this incredible just accomplishment. There's no other way to say it in less than 12 months to go from a pandemic disease to vaccines being available, although, you know, albeit less than we need and not everybody's getting them and logistical hurdles, but scientifically, the fact that that was even possible is unbelievable. I think in the good things here that the CBER division of the FDA, which is a group that typically works to create those VRBPACs or those vaccines meetings, they've been a group that has helped development for these emerging infectious diseases. Like we have a product that's for chikungunya, and that is a disease that's not well known and not well characterized, and where we need scientific advancement. And in working with them, some of those regulatory barriers that typically exist, they help to eliminate those barriers, things like accelerated approval and breakthrough status, and things that help manufacturers, even the design of a trial, that help manufacturers kind of get that investment to go forward. But I think factors that are at play here don't always get to play in other pharmaceutical environments or even other vaccines. As Bill mentioned, the incredible amount of funding, like for small companies or companies that have to prioritize their own financial resources, often that is a factor in how quickly the science can advance, just literally how much money you have. And the conditions were right. There was so much government funding to infuse research and development. So hopefully either that will continue or the investment community will, as Bill was saying, want to invest more in infectious diseases, which hasn't been the case. I think the other factor is just the, you know, what's going to be there on the other side of it. So there's the R&D costs, and then there's the commercial like reward at the other end of it. And that's in that conversation, like Bill was saying, if this goes from being a single product COVID vaccine to being a seasonal vaccine that includes influenza and a COVID, you know, strain, well, then what happens to companies if this was a regular environment and the government wasn't funding it, and so you had expended your own capital for development, and all of a sudden, you know, 2 years later, there's no market for you. I think those are real, you know, business factors that have to be considered, and how applicable today's environment is to, you know, other pharmaceutical situations.
I mean, certainly one of the questions that we faced early on, as I mentioned, you know, when the sequence became available and my chief scientific officer came to me and said, you know, we've got this new virus out there that seems to be killing people in China. We just got the sequence. Do we want to develop something here? And my response was, let's see, let's do the minimum that we can do right now. So develop a seed stock, and then let's see whether or not this is going to be a commercial opportunity, or it's going to be like SARS, or it's going to, you know, it's going to be a quick hitter and go away, or H1N1, you know, where there's no long-term commercial opportunity. And so, you know, the other organizations, like we were collaborating, as I said, with the University of Oxford, who really pushed the development of this vaccine hard as an academic, and they went right into the animals and did a lot of work early on that allowed us then to jump into the clinic very quickly and continue to move that forward. And obviously we, when we realized the global ramifications of this, and it was really looking like it was going to stay with us and be a problem, you know, jumping back in and working with our colleagues there to try and continue the development pretty quickly. But again, as was stated earlier, one of the issues for us, you know, we're a small company. We've got 40 people and limited financial resources, in addition to limited, you know, people resources. And so you're making decisions and prioritizing what program you're going to work on and when and how you're going to deploy that that limited capital. And so those are all questions that come into play as you're starting these things.
Yeah, I think I have a much greater appreciation for the risks involved in something of this magnitude and requiring such a investment in human capital, where to really leverage that, it comes from, not a knock on big companies, but, to really make to take full advantage of the human capital around the world requires really leveraging smaller, companies and upstarts and that have that flexibility, but yet the risks are so much greater. And then to ramp up, it seems like, especially the way that story Abby told, you have to really take risks on other ends of the business that have like very stable revenue streams to throw into this thing where there's a chance that not only will you save the world, but hopefully you'll save your business and keep your business going as well. And so I think the magnitude of the decisions that are made at very early stages aren't fully appreciated, outside of your environment. And so I really appreciate those stories. And I don't know if there's some emphasis you'd like to make on it's more of a comment than a question as a moderator, but I think for me it just it's a real lesson that I've learned today. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that was one of the big points along the development way. So, so Vaccitech is in a unique position. So we had human data in another coronavirus with MERS. So with our platform technology, and it was very promising. And now, if you overlap the data that we have in MERS with the data that we have in COVID-19, they look very similar. And so it allowed us to have a good idea that this was going to work. And so very early on in this process, it was okay. We're a 40-person company and we're collaborating with the university. We've got a potential that 7.8 billion doses might be required. How are we going to do that? And so we're working through ways to think about manufacturing and raw material supply and all those things. And the easiest answer was find a big pharma partner to collaborate with who knows how to do this, right? So that was one of the reasons that we got involved with AstraZeneca. We talked to a number of big pharma players, and that was really designed to reduce manufacturing risks and reduce commercialization risks, because they do this all the time. We do the discovery part, we do the early development and the translational part of it. but pharma is really good at manufacturing and distribution and marketing.
So on the marketing side, though, and I'll be curious what Abby sort of says here as well as Bill, but from a marketing point of view, you knew you have, I'm saying this to see if you disagree, but you knew you have a guaranteed market because first of all, the product is bought. And secondly, there's a gazillion people out there who were beating the market for you, creating the market demand, overcoming the resistance, which the manufacturers didn't have to pay for. So in some ways, at least there was this, again, cooperative partnership effort. I know that, so much of the work that I did with and people that were doing what I'm doing, we were beating the bushes like crazy without any compensation, no money, but you're just out there night and day trying to get over the hurdle of vaccine resistance. So in this sense, it really was a wonderful team effort where the risks taken by business were at least to some degree offset by the support, non-financial, on actually making sure that the market was guaranteed and that the demand was going to be there.
I think that's the point I was trying to make, though, Reed, is that, yes, there was an immediate market. Like in the year 2021, there was clearly going to be a market. But in some ways, it also meant that you had to be there when the market was available for however many people were going to get it, right? So clearly, Pfizer and Moderna made it to the market. Merck announced today, right, withdrawing their program didn't advance. I think GSK and Sanofi had challenges. So, but some of those companies invested their own money trying to just get to a market and didn't get there. Other companies, certainly, Pfizer didn't take any government funding, right? So they decided that the constraints of funding were too undesirable and that they were more interested in having full control of their situation and their path to market. And I'm a former Pfizer employee. It's where I cut my teeth, where I learned all my marketing after the Johns Hopkins business enterprise classes. Actually, I think there was a question in the chat that was like, what did you learn from school? And honestly, I was a scientist. I was in the biotechnology program, science program first, and I took marketing of biotechnology. And I said, at Johns Hopkins, and I said, wow, you could make this a business. I want that. And worked at Pfizer and, got into marketing. So I would say, that's very typical Pfizer to want to be in control of their own destiny in terms of supplying the market and creating the market. But a lot of these companies had to go at risk and hope there was going to be a market, not just in 2021 if they could get there, but really you don't invest in a vaccine for 1 year. You invest in it for 10, 20. I have a vaccine that's 35 years old with only one competitor. So we basically split the market. But if you think about that, you're making an investment, and to use some like business terminology, typically an NPV model or net present value of an asset, you're looking at the upfront costs and development costs and manufacturing cost of goods relative to a 10 to 30 year trajectory. And in this case, there was definitely a immediate market, but possibly not a long-term market. And thinking about how the products are going to compete again, BioNTech and Pfizer are getting there first with Moderna, but are those going to be the vaccines that if there was a standalone vaccine, 10 years from now, if it wasn't combined with influenza, are those going to be the types of vaccines we use with 2 doses and special handling? Or would a single dose vaccine like J&J's end up being the market leader, in which case all of that cost drops away? I think to go back to part of the question you had asked, Dan, too, which was about, what would you advise a business, or like, what were your reflections? I think for me, it's really know what your company is good at. And Bill was was basically talking about that. Like, is our company the company? Is Vaccitech the company that's going to like do this? I had a similar, evaluation. I have multiple platforms in my pipeline. I'm over research and development here too. We had platforms that were similar to platforms at other companies, but when we looked at them, they were too early in their developmental journey to know that they could really not only be clinically safe and effective potentially, but manufacturing. Could we scale up? Could we produce? Could we deliver the market? And the data wasn't as evolved as some of the data like Bill was talking about with his vaccines. So when we looked at our platforms and we looked at our portfolio in vaccines versus our CDMO capabilities, our therapeutics capabilities, we said, where is Emergent best positioned to really support this? Is it through all of our capabilities, or is it really through just these 2? And that's where we focused. And I think it's as important to know what you're good at and what you're going to go forward on, as it is to be realistic around what's not a good space for you to play from a business perspective. Otherwise, you can spend a lot of money if you don't have a lot of disposable money sitting around. You can waste a lot of money trying really, in a very futile way.
Thanks. So I think it's a good, I like this focus on the kind of business lessons, and a lot of the questions from our audience are along those lines. So hopefully some of these can be not long responses, but I think they all kind of deserve long responses because there are a number of questions I want to touch on. So here's a question from Zachary Britt. Are there specific aspects of the regulatory context that you think have either helped or hindered the pharmaceutical industry's response to COVID-19? And do you think there are regulatory lessons we should learn and apply in anticipation of future health crises? It's a deep question. It's from one of our students, so they ask good questions.
Well, I think two things, and I'll start, and then maybe Bill, if you want to chime in. To me, just the speed with which we got to a VRBPAC meeting, and that's the meeting where typically the FDA invites manufacturers who are developing vaccines to have a conversation with each other. So often there's an advisory committee, which is just for your product getting approved, and it's kind of one manufacturer with the FDA. But a VRBPAC is a more open forum. It involves manufacturers, it involves academicians, it involves healthcare providers, patient advocates. It's a very broad and open conversation. Often those take like a year or more to organize and schedule. They're huge productions that the FDA has to put on. They're an incredible amount of data gathering, just the data package that has to be consolidated. So to me, the fact that the FDA was able to organize that with such speed, with such collaboration with the industry to get that conversation going so quickly, that guidance then allowed manufacturers to know what the path forward was going to be. Also with a flexibility from the FDA to work in parallel, like Bill was saying, usually things are very sequential. Like you have to do step A and then share it with the agency and then get feedback, and then step B and then share it with the agency and get feedback. And each of those things are like 90-day submissions. Like you file it, you wait 90 days just to hear back. You try to schedule a meeting, that could be another 90 days. So just that process typically takes quarters or a year to go from step A to B to C to D. And the fact that the FDA was willing to be so out of the box and say, like, you basically have very little data and no path that's been carved, but we're going to work with you all. And if we talk to this manufacturer and agree to this, we're going to share that, with another manufacturer so that you can all be more operating. That would typically be a competitive disadvantage, right? From a manufacturer's perspective, you don't want anybody else to have any advantage. You want the advantages. You don't want anybody else to have them. So the fact that there was that level of collaboration across the industry, and then that level of collaboration within the FDA to see a good idea and try to share it and be flexible and be iterative and be running in parallel, that's all not, the typical.
In addition to the speed issue, the one thing that we learned from the regulatory elements in this particular case has been the importance of, again, transparency and trustworthiness. Because government was put in a posture where it was untrustworthy, seemed to be political, and people could not have confidence in the process, the people that were involved outside of the government regulatory process, but those academicians that Abby talks about, those other researchers who were involved in making the decision that then goes to the FDA, was exceedingly important. And in particular, I would tell you that having people of color in visible places in that process was absolutely essential to those of us who were trying to overcome the legacy of hard-earned distrust by people of color in the process. So I would just sort of make that very small point, but a very important point. It was really critical to have people that you can trust in the process. But for every American, I think all of America benefited from having a clearly visualizable group of people that were not under the control of the administration, who were making recommendations based on science, and that we could have confidence in that.
I'd like to pick up a little bit on this issue of trust and the importance of trust. And it's just to emphasize a lot of what has already been discussed, but I think this idea that, can I trust a vaccine that, came out in 1 year when the last time it took like 4, like, we're corners cut. So, and I hear all this parallel processing, and I haven't heard a single corner cut, but that's just me talking. And I think it's worth for, from a kind of public health perspective to just hear from you, your own perspective on that, having been in the process the past year, just to kind of do your own public health messaging around, what happened the past year to get this vaccine out, and the safety of, the process, or the trustworthiness of the process.
Well, as a person who's had to do that public health messaging, that's why I made the point to Bill earlier, a few minutes back, which is a sense that people believed that somehow we did this from a standing start. And that's why I'm saying we have to go back and realize that the infrastructure was put in place well before this, because we were unprepared for the previous epidemics. And so so I'll just make the point very simply. It is that we need to tell, and I've been on a gazillion radio shows where I've gone through that process with people to say, this did not come from a standing start once we knew that we were in a pandemic. Oh, now we're going to start developing a vaccine. The predicate was already well in place, and that's important. I think the other message we're going to have to give to people is the investment in America's research enterprise. I hope to God we will not have to go back and litigate the escalation in the funding for the NIH and for the CDC and these other agencies, because it is the ability to have the precursors and the predicates in place that will allow us to deal with the next one coming down the pipe.
No, I'd absolutely agree with that. I guess I broaden it, since I'm a UK company, to not just US funding, but you make a great point. The programs that were initially developed here, so Moderna's, Pfizer's, AstraZeneca's, J&J's, these are all platform technologies. They've been in, as a platform, have been in numerous clinical studies. There is a solid safety database in other indications on top of COVID-19. So there's some familiarity from the regulatory agencies with the safety database that underlies the platforms. Like you said, it wasn't from a standing start. Some of that was because we recognized, from previous pandemics, but a lot of that was really, companies pushing forward on their development opportunities, looking at platform technologies to try and get the biggest bang for your buck. If you're using a platform technology, some of these things are pretty plug and play on the manufacturing side, the CMC side, the safety side, because a lot of the platform is understood and well understood. And so that drives a lot of it. I think, in addition, as I talked about, some of the things are, the improvements from the regulatory sciences, right? So there are release assays that have been available for a long time that can cut 30 days off of a particular release assay, that weren't implemented because there's a long process in the regulatory, to move from tried and true methods, that may take 60 days and over one that you can do in 2 weeks. And that doesn't seem like a big deal in kind of a normal 10 to 12 year product development cycle. But in the pandemic, shaving 45 days off a release assay is pretty important when people are dying at the rate that they're dying. So I think there was a willingness to look at those things. Again, good science behind it. As I said, no clinical studies were cut. No safety studies were cut. I mean, in fact, I know we delayed our entrance into the clinic and testing this in people until we had data in non-human primates, because we wanted to understand and make sure that there was a particular safety issue that was theoretical in nature. We wanted to make sure that wasn't going to be an issue before we put it in people. So when we weren't alone, I mean, people, they really didn't take shortcuts. They just did things in parallel. And that goes down to when you're talking about the time in between the regulatory agencies, 90 days in between this and that, it also, it's on the back end when you're looking at the approval process, right? Typically we give ourselves at least a year from when we submit the regulatory filings to when you might get approval, and that was done in 2 weeks. And it was done in 2 weeks because there was rolling submissions, and they were looking at data as it was coming available, and from both from the clinical perspective as well as from the CMC, the manufacturing perspective. They were reviewing everything on a rolling basis as it happened, and so I don't think you can do that with everything. I think that's not going to be something that you can implement across the board, because I don't think there's resources for that. But I think, in these extreme situations, I think there are ways to do things more quickly than is typical without taking shortcuts.
And I would say, Dan, like the simplest answer to your "were corners cut, should we be concerned" is, would one of us take the vaccine? And I don't fall into a high risk category. I'm not frontline healthcare professional. I'm not over 65. But if the vaccine was sitting there and someone said, "Hey, we've got shots left over, Moderna, Pfizer, would you take it?" Absolutely. I would take any of these vaccines if they were available, not only for my own protection, because I believe that the benefits outweigh the risks of them for where they are at this point, right? These are EUA approved. They're not fully licensed. I'm sure we'll learn more as they complete the full process as defined by the FDA. But for what we know now, the benefits absolutely outweigh the risks. And not only to me personally, but to society, right? The more people get vaccinated, the more we get to herd immunity, the more we go back to whatever we're going to be after this, right? On the other side of this, but something better than staying trapped in our houses all the time, feeling like we can roam the world again. So I think they're absolutely safe and effective for the purpose they were designed for. And, I think the fact people might not understand that in typical clinical trials, you don't always test them in tens of thousands of people. These clinical trials, some have 30, 40,000 people in a single clinical trial. So I think that should also give people confidence that that bar of knowing what type of side effects people might have, to be able to set the right expectations. No vaccine, no pharmaceutical product comes without any side effects, without any risks. But I think these are all the kind of more standard that you would see with a powerful immune response that lets the vaccine is working, not something that should concern people that corners were cut and maybe they're not safe and, people should wait. So bottom line, I would get it if it was available today, any one of them.
Not only would I get it, I would give it to my kids. I have no hesitancy in giving any of those vaccines to the kids. Now, we don't know everything, we don't know what the duration of immunity is going to be on these. There's a lot of unknowns, and we'll continue to, in post-marketing surveillance, we'll continue to gain more information about this and how it interacts with the variants, and that will continue to develop. But I'm confident in the safety of the products that are being offered as for emergency use authorization.
Thank you. It's an important message to be delivered, so I very much appreciate it. I'm going to zag a little bit from the zigging and go back to a more business-oriented questions that come from the Q&A. These are kind of two questions that I'm going to read together. At what point do you pull the trigger to move beyond the seed stock? And when you think, for people who are thinking about startups to understand partnerships, can you explain a little bit about this business relationship with Oxford from the perspective of, I guess, young folks looking for startups and thinking about how to leverage something like that? Or was it a little bit of lightning in the bottle?
No, so that's a great question. So I'll start with that one. The company was actually spun out of the University of Oxford. So it was, our scientific co-founders are still at the university and have been very involved in the COVID-19 vaccine development on the clinical side as well. Doctors Adrian Hill and Sarah Gilbert. And so they're still on our board as observers, or at least Adrian is, and Sarah's actually totally focused on the vaccine development. So she was a board member and resigned so she could focus on the vaccine development. But so we had underlying rights to the platform for COVID-19. We've developed, we had co-invented IP on the product. And so when we decided that we were going to license this to a big pharma partner, what we did was Vaxtech licensed our IP back to the university in exchange for a share of the revenue that they'll get from AstraZeneca in terms of milestones and royalties. And I guess that's one of the things that I wanted to raise here. And when you're talking about the government funding and the availability of the market, at least from an AstraZeneca and in the University of Oxford perspective, because in part because of that funding, in part because of the morality issues and ethical concerns, AstraZeneca is not selling this for profit during the pandemic period, right? So they're selling it cost plus during this pandemic period. And I think that puts them in a unique situation. So they're taking advantage of the government funding to reduce risk, but they're not taking advantage of that government funding. They're making sure that we can get that out to as many people as quickly as possible. Now that, I think, from a long-term profitability perspective, that's a short-term thing to deal with the underlying pandemic, but we're looking at this as a long-term disease that's going to be endemic. And then, so there will be freedom to raise prices. And the question about is when is the pandemic under control, and when do you start doing that? And then the other question, moving from a seed stock. So that was kind of an iterative process, to be honest. It is really taking a continual look as to when do we need to start moving things into preclinical testing, if in fact this is going to be as big of an issue as it turned out to be. And so you're kind of continually weighing. And this was real time, because remember, January 1 of last year, we didn't have a COVID-19 project. By the end of April, it was in phase 3 clinical trials and out licensed to AstraZeneca, which is just unheard of. It's absolutely unheard of. So everything was real time, daily discussions. And it continues to be, even on the manufacturing issues. That's part of the issues when you're talking about supply and transparency. It's very difficult because not every manufacturing run is successful, and so you're putting into your projections, we're going to have this many doses available, and then you have a manufacturing failure. You have a bacterial contamination issue, or you have a bioreactor spring a hose leak, or something crazy, and the run fails, and then all of a sudden now you're only able to supply 2/3 of what you thought you were going to supply, or there was a fire in one of the facilities in India, there was a flood in a facility in Wales. I mean,
So
things,
I'm
things
afraid I'm
happen.
going to cut you off. We're getting near the end, and I really have one more burning question. So the Biden administration has come out with a goal, 100 million doses in 100 days. Some thoughts on, can we do it? What do we have to expect going ahead?
Well, I think first we got to make sure we are committed as a combined society to get it done. I mean, first of all, and then secondly, it is a noble effort, but I think it's going to be tough to predict that we can actually do it. Certainly, you cannot do it with the way we've been approaching it today, and that this is going to be very difficult. So we're going to have to mobilize every asset we have available, not only on the manufacturing side, but on the delivery side, and use assets more intelligently than they have been used. I saw Abby trying to get in. I'm sorry, I went before you.
That's okay. I think this is absolutely a case where we should shoot for the stars and hope we land on the moon, because I think it's the right aspiration. To break it down from where we are, at the end of December, we were administering in the US 200,000 doses a day. By the early part of January, we were administering 400,000 doses a day. And that was just about a week ago. So we need to be more than doubling that to get to 1 million doses a day for 100 days to get to 100 million. So I think it's the right aspiration. And again, I hope this isn't the case where we make it to 850,000 doses a day and we call that a failure, because that would still be a tremendous improvement quickly from where we are now. So let's shoot for the stars and hope if we don't hit the stars, we land on the moon, because it definitely needs to be more than 400,000 doses a day at this point to get everybody vaccinated.
I'm maybe be a little bit controversial here and say, should we have that as a goal? Because I think if you look at it from a global perspective, if the U.S. is getting 100 million doses in that short period of time, then our healthcare workers in Ghana getting a vaccine, should we be vaccinating people that aren't in the high risk groups in the U.S. before healthcare workers in other countries or high risk people in other countries get the vaccine?
I think that is such an important point. But I think also, for example, and Daniel, you'll know, with the committee that we served on at the National Academy of Medicine, we did speak to the notion of having to reserve a certain percentage of doses here in the United States for worldwide use. I think people are trying to be thoughtful about that point, Bill. And all I can do is applaud you. No, but I don't see you as being I think I'm applauding you because there is that moral question that has to be confronted. Are we on a planet with other human beings, or are we having this naive kind of America first kind of thing where we're allowed to let other people just, let them die, the hell with them, they're not Americans? I'm glad you raised it, and I commend you for raising it.
Yeah, and speed should not come at the expense of our values and equity. If we just went and gave the closest person the next 100 million vaccines, some of the structural issues, both in our country and around the world, around those with the greatest resources tend to get first in line, would continue. And I think it's important that we, so I appreciate that, Bill, take a moment to think about, putting all our values forward and not just speed. I want to thank our panelists. That was really an incredible journey from discovery through manufacturing and commercialization onto delivery. We covered a lot of ground and even hit the globe at the very end. So thank you, Bill, for that. I'm going to turn it back over to Alex for some closing words, and just thank you again for a great panel.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Dan,
the opportunity.
Absolutely. And thank you, Dan, for moderating this very lively and highly informative discussion. And great thanks to Abby, to Bill, and Reed for sharing your expertise. It was an absolutely wonderful and dynamic panel. I also want to thank the audience for joining us and for your many good questions. I know we weren't able to get to all of them, but there were a lot of fabulous questions. Well, finally, I just want to say, I hope we see you all again on February the 24th for our next presentation. Eddie Brown, who is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Brown Capital Management, will be our distinguished guest. So until then, have a great evening, and everybody, please stay healthy.